in Module 2, and we're going to cover today regulatory and warning signs, a little bit about temporary signs, hazard markers and parking signs. So we've got quite a bit to cover. Let's get into it. Firstly, the exercise that we set you. I think I said that it's not necessarily the easiest exercise in the world, but that's one of the reasons we get you to do it and to do it yourselves, because finding your way through the different diagrams, tables, graphs, and whatever is not that easy. But once you've done it once, it's not that difficult to do it again. So in our particular case, we had a ball bank indicator reading of 15 degrees at a survey speed of 50 kilometres an hour. So you go across there, hit the 50 kilometres an hour line, and then read downwards, and you get pretty close to a 45 kilometre an hour speed limit. I think someone actually rounded it up to 50 because it's a little bit above the 45, but it's so close to 45. I think that that's good enough for our purposes. And that fits within the shaded area, so that means it's a valid survey speed to be able to take those results from. And that is from figure F2 within the Australian Standard. And then the next graph is you look at this figure 4.5 to determine what sort of warning sign do you need. Do you need a turn warning sign, which is the sharp angled one, or a curve warning sign? So with an advisory speed of 45 kilometres an hour and a 85th percentile approach speed of 90 kilometres an hour, it intersects there, which is sort of just into the C zone probably, but pretty close to the B zone as well. So I reckon either B size or C size would be acceptable for the curve warning sign. Some of you went one way, some of you went the other way, some of you actually recognised that it's on the border and you could go either way. That's fine. So B or C size for the curve warning sign. And then the question is the cams, the chevron alignment markers that go around the curve, are they required or not? We have an advisory speed of 45 kilometres an hour and an 85th percentile approach speed of 90 kilometres an hour. So we're in this region of the graph, which means that cams are definitely required, and the spacing should be on the right-hand column of this table. And use the B size. Some of you might have got a bit confused about whether you need the B or C size for the curve warning sign compared to what size do you need for the cams. But this clearly indicates that it's the cams that need to be the B size. And for a curve radius of 60 metres, the spacing of the cams should be 8 metres approximately between the cams. And I think some of you worked out that that means you need 12 cams around the curve. Yep. So lay them out around the curve, something like this. You certainly need the curve warning sign and 45 kilometre an hour advisory speed subplate on this approach. You also need it on the other approach, and you need the cams going around the corner like this. This is drawn pretty schematically. It's not accurately to scale. It looks like the size of the cams is about the width of the road, which obviously is not to scale. And the placement of the cams should be, the first one should be in line with the edge line in this direction. So that's where the first one should be placed. And in this direction, it should be in line with the center line of the road. And actually the way this is drawn, probably that one is not really required. Even that one might not be required. Maybe that one is about where the first one needs to start. But as I say, it's not exactly to scale here. We didn't ask you to determine how far back from the start of the curve should the warning sign be on this approach and this approach. But if you did look at that, and I think a couple of you did, it's dimension A in the Australian Standard, and I get 60 to 80 metres for dimension A, which comes from this table in the Australian Standard. Dimension A, if you must or may need to stop, well, for a curve you don't. Significant reduction in speed required, probably maybe yes. Low to moderate speed reduction, probably. And you're in the 70 to 90 kilometre an hour range, so I've chosen 60 to 80 metres here. These require a bit of interpretation, but that seems like a reasonable solution. Yes, and actually says here, signs in the curve sign zone in figure 4.5. So that actually points you directly to what you're talking about from this table. So that's in Appendix D to the Australian Standard 1742 Part 2 and applies to all warning signs and in terms of how far in advance of the thing they're warning of should be. And other signs as well. So dimension A and dimension B come into the discussions within the Australian Standard quite a bit. So it's good to understand this table D. Okay, so now we can get into today's session unless there are any questions that have come up, Kathy.
Yeah, there is. Thanks, David. Can you explain the rotation angle of the chevron?
The rotation angle. I'm not quite sure what they mean by the rotation angle, but just to, one other thing I did want to explain is that this plan view of the signs and the sign faces, etc., the circle is supposed to represent the pole in the ground, and the black line represents the sign face, even though it's completely out of scale on this diagram. And it's important, particularly when you're drawing it to scale, that the sign face is directed to exactly towards where you want it to be facing in the real world. So some of you just sort of laid out these things looking in any particular direction, which doesn't sort of make sense. They've got to be faced towards the oncoming traffic. So I'm not quite sure whether that's what they mean by orientation angle, but that hopefully answers that question.
It sure does. Terrific. Thanks for that.
All right, let's continue on. When we think of regulatory signs, probably the first type of sign you think of is a speed limit sign. And of course, that is the maximum permitted speed applying to a length of road. And those words, length of road, are important because that's actually what it says in the road rules, that the speed limit applies to a length of road until you get to the end of the road or another speed limit sign. So it doesn't apply to the length of road around a corner, which is a different road, unless you use an area sign. So this is important to understand, that it will apply to the length of road until you get to another speed limit sign or the road ends. They are major traffic control devices. So in Victoria, they require approval from the DOT, and there's a lot of information about how to set speed limits, which can be found in the speed zoning guidelines. Here's just a little bit of history. Old speed limit signs used to be in a yellow circle, and of course they were in miles per hour. And then up to about 1974, they were still in miles per hour and were in this format, which is actually still the same as the design of these signs in America. But then in around about 1974, these standards were changed to adopt the red circle idea, which is actually borrowed from European conventions. And that's what we now have. And both of those pictures, by the way, are taken on Burwood Highway at around about the same place. So there's a bit of a before and after. There are different types of speed limit signs. The area signs apply to an area, and the end area sign ends that area, and it's important that you include the end area signs to make it a legal speed limit area. School zone signs you're probably familiar with, together with the time plates. The time plates are difficult to read, and the interpretation of school days is also a bit difficult to understand, but that's the best you can do unless you implement an electronic sign. There are other time-based speed limit signs as well, but again, certainly if the times are unusual times, then it's much, much better to use an electronic sign rather than asking the driver to actually read the time plate underneath the limit. Shared zones are another type of speed limit sign. They invoke a road rule that says not only must you comply with the speed limit, which should be either 5 or 10 kilometres an hour, or actually sometimes 20. Actually, I think it's supposed to be 10 or 20 kilometres an hour. But the other part of the road rule is that the driver is obliged to give way to pedestrians on the road. So there's sort of a shared responsibility that the drivers have to give way to the pedestrians. The pedestrians, on the other hand, can't just sort of jump out in front of a car. And to ensure that shared zones are legal, you also need to have the end shared zone sign at every departure point from the shared zone area. Cool. Then we have speed limit signs that are advance or advisory, and they all have a black circle rather than a red circle, which is a bit of a subtlety, but the idea is this is not the regulatory sign itself. There is another regulatory sign ahead somewhere or around the corner. If it's something like this that's saying that it's 40 kilometres an hour on the side road, but not on this road. And that one also has the ahead word on it, so therefore it's got a black annulus. And these are signs which just help to highlight to the driver that it's a new speed limit, it's been changed. So this new speed limit ahead would go before the new speed limit sign, or you use the new limit plate which goes underneath the new speed limit sign. And those signs are on a yellow background to sort of indicate that it's like warning that something has changed, and they should be in place for a limited amount of time. Don't leave them out there forever. And there's quite a few of those signs that I've observed that have been up there for most of 2020. So a maximum duration of 3 months is what we recommend. I actually went looking for where that is documented and I couldn't find it quickly, but I'm pretty sure that there is something somewhere that says they should be removed after about 3 months. I think this is taken from the VicRoads speed zoning guidelines about how you lay it out on a school zone, and that guidance is good. Electronic signs are preferable if you can afford to put them in. So that's just an indication of how you can lay it out around a school zone. Ensure that speed zones and speed signs are used correctly. This is a picture taken somewhere in the Northern Territory, and it's a road hump. And the idea was to indicate that there should be an advisory speed of 20 kilometres an hour as you drive over the road hump. It should not be a regulatory sign. And because the roads in Northern Territory go for a very long distance, that speed limit of 20 kilometres an hour applies legally along the length of the road until you get to the next speed limit sign, which might be in Alice Springs, who knows? So let's be careful about things like that. it should be a 20 km/h advisory speed on a yellow background, not the regulatory one. And pretty clearly, don't do stupid things like this. Is it 60? Is it 80? Is it 8 kilometres an hour on one side of the road and 80 kilometres an hour on the other side of the road? Clearly, those things shouldn't happen. Okay, now let's get into intersection warning signs, and they should be used where there's insufficient sight distance to the side road or to the intersection itself, and they're provided in advance of the intersection, not right at the intersection itself, or if there's any unexpected or unusual intersection layouts. Now, this particular sign, the crossroad warning sign, used to be just a cross, but now it has an arrowhead on the top, and the side bar, the horizontal bar, is just slightly narrower than the vertical bar, in order to try to convey to the driver that they have priority through this intersection. So it's warning you that there's an intersection there, but it's also telling you that you are on the priority road and the side roads have to give way to you. And not only is that an important message to convey to the driver, but it's also an important message to convey to the practitioner to make sure the practitioner uses the correct sign. And that's because there's been court cases where people have been driving along a long, straight, boring rural road and have gone through several intersections where the crossroad warning has been there, and they sail through them, and then they come up to another intersection, the same warning sign is there, but this happens to be the highway that they've come across, and they have an obligation to stop and give way, or at least give way, at the highway intersection, which is different to all the other intersections that they've just been through. They had a crash there, they took VicRoads to court and said they used the wrong warning sign, which was true. The VicRoads people had put up the wrong warning sign. If you are facing a give way or a stop sign, you should be putting up the give way or stop sign warning, not the crossroad warning. So that's an important one of these other guidelines, which is a very strict guideline. Don't use these intersection warning signs unnecessarily, because then it reduces their effectiveness where they're really important. So you don't really need to put up an intersection warning sign if there is one of these big green direction signs, because the big green direction sign is telling you there's a road off to the left anyway. So you don't really need to have the intersection warning sign as well. Besides which, it shouldn't be mounted on the same pole, and it shouldn't be in a place where it's likely to be hidden by the grass when it grows. If there are other devices or geometric cues that give sufficient information, you really don't need to put up the warning sign. And if the intersection is no different to other nearby intersections. So in other words, just use judgment and use the warning signs where they're really important, not everywhere. So these are the signs that should be placed on the major or through road, the road that has priority. We've talked about the crossroad sign, and note the arrowhead. And these are other versions of that which are acceptable. There are all these different versions trying to cover most situations, but it can't cover all situations. So sometimes the traffic engineer shows a bit of initiative and decides to create their own symbolic signs to more accurately reflect the intersection geometry. But there are big dangers in doing so, because this sign could easily be interpreted as a Tommy gun or something else. And just because the traffic engineer thinks that this is a good diagram of the plan view of the intersection, it doesn't mean that it's going to actually make sense to the driver. So use the standard signs wherever you possibly can if they fit the requirements. If it doesn't quite match the circumstances and you think you need to design something different, make sure that it undergoes very careful testing. And also within Victoria, permission from the appropriate people in the DOT to use a non-standard sign. So I'm always a bit torn by this because consistency is good, standardization is good, the guidelines do the best they possibly can, but they're not always going to cover every situation. So there are always going to be places and cases where a different sign is the better solution. But it just needs to be done very carefully and with thorough testing, that people, particularly if it's a symbolic sign, that people actually understand what the symbol means. The other thing I love about this sign is the word obscured on it, because it's definitely an obscure sign. And the idea is that it's trying to tell you that when you turn left through this left turn slip lane, there's actually a driveway there, which is difficult to see. But I'm sure that the sign is actually not helping that situation, because it's the obligation is on the person, the driver coming out of the driveway, to give way anyway, and it's very unlikely that a driver will slow down or be any more alert just because they've seen this obscure sign. Okay, so show care with new symbols. Intersection warning signs. So advanced warning of intersection control devices ahead, used where there's restricted sight distance to the regulatory sign at the intersection and on high speed approaches, but again, not necessarily everywhere. So if you're on a rural road approaching an intersection where the driver has to stop or give way, then these are the two signs that should be used, not the crossroad warning sign. And if there are signals ahead, clearly that is what's used. And if there's a roundabout ahead, that is what's used, if necessary. So for example, this is a fairly wide angle photo, so it's a little bit difficult to see that there are traffic signals there, but in real life, it is very clear that there are traffic signals there. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 traffic signal lanterns facing the driver. All of the street lighting, all of the other cues to the driver, like the left turn slip lane and the bus lane here. Almost everything is advising the driver that there are signals ahead. It really is unnecessary to have a warning sign to say traffic signals ahead. I'm sure it's adding no value whatsoever. It's just a maintenance headache, because it certainly needs to be replaced anyway. So don't overuse the signs. And there is a tendency for traffic engineers working on a particular project to say, oh, this is my intersection, I want to make sure it's as safe as possible, I'll put up all these warning signs. But you've got to look at it in a more holistic way. We want to try to protect the effectiveness of signs where they're really needed, rather than just putting them in everywhere. Other intersection warning signs, such as the T intersection warning sign used on the minor road that terminates, not normally used on approaches controlled by stop or give way signs or traffic signals. So again, don't overuse it. Island warning signs, to advise of islands. Merging traffic, if two traffic streams merge, and the classic place for that is on ramps coming onto freeways. But if there's a give way situation, a give way sign and a give way line, then the merging sign should not be used. Merging from left, merging from right. So here's an example on a freeway where someone's put up the appropriate merging sign, but the old merging traffic sign is still there as well. I mean, you know, if you're putting up a new sign, you take down the old sign. So that's important. Every new sign we put up should be an opportunity to get rid of something else. It's a little rule of thumb that I try to impose. Okay, a bit about freeway signs. The freeway interchange signs, no entry, wrong way, and wrong way, go back, are important to make sure that people don't go the wrong way down a ramp. And you probably don't see those signs very often because hopefully you don't drive the wrong way down a ramp, but they are pretty important. It was more of a problem, you know, maybe 20 or 30 years ago when freeways were pretty new and people were getting used to them. But with the standard diamond interchange design these days, there's very few wrong way movements. These signs are actually regulatory signs. They're telling you no pedestrians, bicycles, tractors beyond this point, etc., etc., etc. And they're called road access signs in the road rules, and they actually have regulatory effect. There are also these signs, start freeway, freeway entrance, and end freeway, which the first two of these are actually not regulatory anymore. They used to be, and they used to be in the road rules to invoke this rule that says pedestrians and bicycles and whatever else was written into the road rules as default were not allowed on the freeway past this point. So it defined the start of the freeway and therefore defined when that road rule applies, and therefore they were regulatory. But they were taken out of the road rules because these became the regulatory signs, but they still have an R prefix. So you remember last time we talked about how do you determine which is a regulatory sign and which isn't a regulatory sign. These are the two examples where the R prefix is actually misleading. Not that it makes too much difference really at the end of the day, but the difference that it makes is that now you have to have one of these signs at every entrance point to the freeway, and you don't have to have these signs. But interestingly, the end freeway is still a regulatory sign and defines the end of the freeway, and therefore these prohibition rules end at that point. So that's a bit of a subtlety, but an interesting change. The layout of signs at a freeway interchange. This is taken from the Australian Standard and is a typical layout, but you do have to read all the words in the Australian Standard. Don't just sort of copy all of these signs because they happen to be on this diagram. You know, exit speed 60 kilometres an hour is definitely an optional sign. You don't have to have that. The wrong way, go back is probably a very good idea still. And most of the rest of them would be fairly standard in most applications. You know, an interesting thing about this is what speed limits apply on the ramp. So the speed limit from this point here to the 110 kilometre an hour speed limit sign is probably, legally speaking, the urban default if you're in an urban area, or the rural default of 100 if you're in a rural area. It probably doesn't matter too much because the police are unlikely to be enforcing speeds over such a short distance. But it's just interesting to be aware of the implications of the road rules. Okay, lane reductions. So there's two types of lane reductions, which are generally called a zip merge, which is a nice sort of terminology, or a lane change. So a zip merge is where there's no continuity line through the merge area. So basically you have a lane line separating the two lanes and then the lane line just finishes. And then under the road rules, the obligation is for the drivers to give way to each other. So you give way to the vehicle that is ahead of you. And therefore it's called a zip because basically the one ahead goes before the next one and then the next one goes behind that one as they zip together. Whereas a lane change has a continuity at the merge area and therefore the vehicle crossing over the continuity line is regarded as actually changing lanes and therefore must give way as they change lanes. So the types of signs we use in these situations are for a zip merge, we use a form 1 lane or form 2 lanes or form 3 lanes, whatever it might be, type of sign. And this is used, for instance, on ramps to freeways, which often start off as 2 lanes and then merge into 1 lane. So a form 1 lane would be appropriate in that location. And also on the departure side of intersections like roundabouts or signalised intersections where there might be an added lane and then within 100 metres or so of the intersection it disappears. Usually it's a zip merge situation. So this is how you would lay them out in particularly in a rural area where you've got plenty of space. Give 200 metres advance warning and then the form 1 lane or form 2 lanes sign right at the point where the merge starts to happen. Where if it's a lane change, on the other hand, then there's a continuity line through the merge area and the vehicles crossing the line need to find a safe gap in the adjacent traffic stream. And then the sequence of signs is left lane ends, however metres ahead, left lane ends merge right, and the merge right sign. So they're laid out in this order. Again, dimension A between the left lane merge right sign and the actual black and white merge right sign, which is right at the point where the continuity line starts and the lane taper happens. So this was all changed, well, not all changed, but some of that was changed in maybe over 10 years ago, but there's still signs out there that don't quite comply with these new rules. And it would be good to update all of those to make sure there's consistency between the signing for zip merges and lane changes. And that also applies to other states where other states had different practices, and this tries to harmonise all of those practices. So lane changing on a freeway, and this is a bit of a Vic Road special, a Victorian special in the Vic Road supplement. Not all the other states do it this way, but rather than having yellow signs, all of these signs are black and white versions. If the sign at this location is overhead, then it just says lane ends merge right. And if it's side mounted, then it says left lane ends merge right. So that's a subtle difference, but important depending on where the sign is. And again, merge right is the large sign that's right at the point where the taper starts. Okay. Road obstructions and hazards. So we don't necessarily have to talk about all of these. There's a lot written in the Australian standards about them. The use of the gravel roadside sign, the slippery sign, trucks entering or crossing. Again, don't overuse that. It should only be used where it's a problem. Reduce speed, definitely don't overuse that. That should be reserved for particularly risky situations, high risk locations. Slow point is probably fair enough, and steep descent and steep ascent are sensible signs to use when that occurs. Someone asked about animal signs. Again, only use where there's an unexpected presence and in consultation with other government departments and wildlife groups. So the Australian Standards Committee, when I was on it, debated long and hard about how we should deal with all of this, because there's all sorts of different animals that might be on the road. And in Western Australia, camels and emus and wild horses are actually a problem. So having signs available to warn of those is fair enough. There were many different forms of the koala sign, but the Australian standards eventually settled on that version, and the wombat sign. And if there are several types of wild animals, or wild animals that aren't one of those symbols, then you can just use the generic wild animals sign. But signing animals is difficult. Let's take kangaroos, because that's probably the most common example. When do you put up a kangaroo warning sign? When there's the potential for a kangaroo to jump across the road? Well, you know, that's virtually every kilometre of road in Western Australia. So you really have to try to only put up the signs in locations where it is a significant problem or a demonstrated problem by crash records, or in consultation with government departments and wildlife groups as to where you're expecting the kangaroos to be. And then taking down the signs also in places where there might have previously been a problem, but there aren't anymore. Otherwise, you end up with warning signs across the whole network. So not an easy issue, but that's the general idea. And in Queensland, of course, someone has a good sense of humour in trying to indicate the problems with cassowaries. Okay, flashing warning signs. So these are examples of warning signs, but in order to make them more conspicuous within the environment, they've been placed on a yellow background, and flashing yellow lights have been put on the top as well to really highlight it to the drivers. So these are non-standard treatments, and they should be considered where this produces a better safety outcome, or not just a better safety outcome, but the highest risk locations in the whole state. You have to reserve these signs for the highest locations. Otherwise they become meaningless. There are many different supplementary plates that can be placed under regulatory signs or warning signs about times, about the locations, exceptions, where it applies on side road, for instance, or over distances. Obviously you do whatever is sensible. One of the rules is that a subplate should always be the same colour as the parent sign above it. Okay, a bit about exclusive use signs such as truck lane, bus only, bicycle lanes, tram only lanes, which are written into the road rules, Road Rule 155A, which is slightly different to a tram lane. A tram lane allows other vehicles to enter it under certain circumstances, whereas tram only does mean only. It's only trams, and I think maybe tram rescue vehicles, if they need to tow a tram or something, I think they might have an exemption. Transit lane signs, the T2 symbol and T3 symbol indicate how many people are permitted in the vehicle if it's a transit lane, but that isn't very well understood. So the actual symbol of the car with the number of people in it is actually put next to it, although fairly small as a symbol. It might be difficult for people to interpret, but if you ask general members of the public what a T2 lane is, often they don't know. So the idea is to try to educate people with the words, the T2 and the symbol all together. And again, there are many supplementary plates that can go with those types of signs. Substandard vertical curves, so crest, where it's a long crest with difficulties for stopping sight distance or overtaking sight distance. And if there's unsafe or high speeds. The road hump, of course, is reserved for the road humps and really should be located at every road hump to warn the driver that it's there. And dip is not used very often, but if there's a sharp depression in the road, then that's the sign to use.
David, we've just got a hand up, so I might just go to Wasim and see if he's got a question. And another question's come through, which I think you can answer. Oh, we got two hands up. We'll do one at a time.
Okay.
For the animal signs earlier, do you need to add an end animal sign?
No.
No.
I don't think I've ever seen an end animal sign. And, you know, what stretch of road does it apply to is always going to be a bit vague anyway. So really you're warning the drivers, and by the time the drivers have driven like, you know, a few hundred meters, they've probably forgotten the sign anyway. So you just assume that it applies over, you know, maybe half a kilometre or something like that.
Okay. Another question was earlier on about when the new speed ahead or new speed zone ahead.
Yep.
Do you know the legislation about booking people where the yellow signs are?
Well, there's no regulation as such. The new speed limit sign applies and can be enforced as soon as it's there facing the traffic.
Yeah, for sure.
So the yellow warning to tell you that it's a new limit, it's not the same as it was yesterday, is just that, a warning. But legally it's enforceable. Now, whether the police have some internal rules about, oh, look, we won't enforce it for the first 2 weeks or something, I don't really know. I imagine that would probably be sensible policy. But certainly there's nothing in legislation to say that it can't be enforced from day one.
Yeah. Okay, great. Wasim, can we hear you?
Yes.
Terrific.
David?
Yep, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question in relation to off-road bike lanes. If we are providing pavement marking, I mean those cycle logos on off-road bike paths, can we choose not to put up regulatory pole signs?
So you've got, is this an exclusive bike lane?
Yes.
On the road or off the road?
No, off the road.
If it's off the road, it's not really a bike lane. I think a bike lane.
No, I mean bike path, off dedicated bike path.
Okay, so it's a dedicated bike path. And which sign are you asking about?
If you go back one slide back.
Yep.
Or maybe one more. Yes. Like this sort of sign, bicycle line, or just a bicycle only, this sort of signs, the regulatory signs.
Well, the regulatory bike lane sign applies to a bike lane on the road.
Yes, but we also have a different signs for off-road dedicated bike paths, which is just, I think, just a cycle logo or cycle only path, that sort of sign.
Yes.
So can we exclude that if we are having pavement logos?
Oh, right. Okay, that's the question. I think I might even cover that at some stage. I can't quite remember. I'll have to remind myself if it doesn't
Okay.
come up in a future slide. The question is whether you need the signs if you've got the pavement markings, and
Yes.
I know that I've had to look that up a couple of times to answer that question as well. The best answer to that question is read the road rule, but we might get to that later, or if we don't, then I'll try to answer you directly.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, was that all, Kathy?
Yes, thank you, David. And we're at the halfway point.
Cool. All right, let's keep going. So we did that one. Oh, we were up to low bridges, I think, weren't we? Okay, so low bridges, it's important to sign them. Don't want people crashing into bridges. As I think I might have mentioned last time, it's the low clearance sign, which is mounted on the bridge itself or on a gantry before the bridge. That is the regulatory sign. And these other signs are not regulatory, they're just advisory or traffic instruction signs. If you do have a low clearance, I think it's a very good idea to have a warning sign as well, because it's important. And sign a detour for high vehicles if that's appropriate. The markers that go around it are as shown here, and we'll get to those again later in the session. And any of you who've kept your eyes on the media about what's happened at the Montague Street Bridge over several crashes, it's just appalling, really. But also a demonstration that signs are not 100% effective. Just because there are signs there doesn't mean to say everyone is looking at them considering, oh, how high is my truck today? And therefore avoiding the problem. It's going to happen sometime. So the idea of these dangly bits that hopefully wake the driver up to tell them that they're over height will do the trick. Last time I drove down Montague Street, it is pretty obvious that it's a low clearance, but still seems to happen. Okay, any other questions? I think we probably dealt with the other ones.
We're all good, David.
All right, good. Let's keep on going because there is quite a bit to get through today. So I'm not going to talk about temporary signs in much detail. There are all sorts of courses available for roadwork signing and going into detail about the roadwork signing code of practice. And I know that there's things happening nationally to try to harmonise the guidance on all of the roadwork type signs. But in terms of the general signing world, they're pretty important, and there's a lot of bad signing practice in association with roadworks and other temporary events. Even recently, people have put up, people have closed off parking spaces and converted them into dining spaces, and I think have oversigned those situations with, event ahead. Well, it's not really an event, it's just people sitting at tables in what used to be parking spaces. And usually they're surrounded by barriers and lots of orange stuff to make it pretty visible. So I'm not sure that the additional signs are creating much value. Generally, these are black text on a yellow background and generally rectangular in shape rather than the more permanent warning signs, which are generally diamond shaped. The regulatory signs also can be part of the temporary signing arrangements. So there's all sorts of layouts and things available in the Code of Practice for Worksite Safety Traffic Management, and also in the Australian Standard Part 3. And I know there's a lot of work and things happening in that space as we speak. So I won't go into that in any more detail. If you're really into roadwork signing, I think come along to one of the roadwork signing courses and traffic controller courses to learn a bit more about that. Hazard markers. So hazard markers are all black and white, apart from the chevron alignment marker. And they indicate a hazard on or along the road that drivers need to avoid and help to delineate the path. And this is why they're given a D prefix. Basically, the D stands for delineation. So examples are where the road narrows, terminus of a road, if there's a lateral shift in the road, curves, curb outstands, the roundabout central island, and splitter islands. Okay, so there's an example. There's a curb outstand. It's a bit hard to see what's in advance of that, but if there's a possibility that a driver might run into that curb, put up a hazard marker. And hazard markers come with the standards are 1 chevron and 4 chevrons, but actually there's no reason why you can't have a similar shaped sign with 2 chevrons or 3 chevrons. And the standard does sort of allow you to do that, even though it doesn't give you standard signs for it. Okay. Then there are bidirectional hazard markers, so with the chevrons pointing in both directions. Very clearly, you need to make sure you've got the right version of those. So for instance, left turn slip lanes, because you can go either side of the island. If you're turning left, you go to the left of the island. If you're continuing straight through, you go to the right-hand side of the island. A bidirectional hazard marker is the way to go. This last one has got a V prefix, which means it's a Victorian special, and there are quite a few of those, particularly on narrow noses or narrow islands where traffic can go both sides of the island. Cool. So here's some examples of bad practice. So for instance, you can go to the right of this island if you're turning right, but you definitely can't go to the wrong side of this island if you're continuing straight through. So that chevron is actually pointing in the wrong direction. And is probably unnecessary anyway. It would be better just to use a keep left sign. And don't bend the markers. Like I don't know why this has sort of grown up as an idea, but the idea presumably is I want to mark where the nose of the island is, so therefore I'll put the sign as close to the nose of the island as I can, and because the nose bends around, I'm going to bend the sign as well so that it's sort of facing any direction you come from. But that's not the idea of hazard markers. Hazard markers are there to warn you as you're approaching from a distance. No one is looking at the marker in plan view. They're looking at it from the driver's point of view, and bending the sign sheeting is likely to diminish its properties of retroreflectivity. And also probably not that much of the sign is facing towards where the driver's headlights are for, maybe 50 or 100 meters back. So don't bother, just keep the sign face flat and even put it a bit further back from the nose. I mean, it doesn't have to be right at the nose. It can be 5 or even 10 meters back. I think in rural areas, the guidelines recommend 10 meters back from the nose. And the reason for that is to avoid too much damage from drivers who might mistakenly drive over it. So, and while we're there, the turn left at any time with care sign has been taken out of the standards. It was the sort of thing that we thought was important to tell drivers about when left turn slip lanes were first introduced or fairly uncommon, but now they're very common. I think drivers know what they're supposed to do. The road rules are very clear about what you're supposed to do. There's no need to put up a turn left at any time with care sign. Indeed, there's really no need to put up a give way to pedestrian sign either, because there's a zebra crossing here. So there's a whole lot wrong with this intersection, which happens to be near where I live. And the more you actually just look at these things, the more you think, oh, why did they do that? Whereas when you're driving past, you often just don't notice.
I'm sure we'll notice lots of things now, David. Thanks for pointing them out. Just a quick question to confirm, if you have a splitter island, you use a hazard marker and not a yellow and black sign. Is that right? If you have a splitter island.
Yes, if you have a splitter island, well, a hazard marker is a black and white sign.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't use the black and yellow sign. And there is, if it's a splitter island, in other words, traffic can go only on one side of the island and traffic is coming towards you in the other side of the island, then the choice is a unidirectional hazard marker or a keep left sign.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. And then you've got sight boards, which are just another usage, if you like, of hazard markers. So if you have a T-junction, particularly in rural areas, you want to make sure that people don't drive all the way through from the stem of the T when there's no road on the far side. They've got to recognise that they have to come to a stop, or at least slow down to give way. So sight boards are very important, and they're called sight boards because it's important that they can be seen from a distance. If there's vertical geometry problems, then mount them up higher or whatever. Just make sure that they're facing towards the drivers as they approach the intersection. Yes, so you can use two unidirectional markers back to back or a bidirectional marker like that. Width markers. So width markers are used where the edge of the road is very close to a vertical obstruction, such as a bridge pier or a culvert. And the idea is that they sort of form a valley, if you like. So the stripes have to be angled down, pointing towards the centre of the road, or towards the middle of the road somewhere. I mean, they're 45-degree angle. You're not going to change the angle of the stripes. But if you turn the sign upside down, it's still got the stripes in the same direction. So you actually have to order one of each from the depot or the store or the sign manufacturer and make sure that you put them correctly on the correct side of the road. If there's a barrier, you put them above the barrier. If there's a curb, about 300 millimeters behind the curb. Yep, so they're width markers. So width markers are what should be on the piers of this bridge, but over time people have tried various options like chevron markers, which is wrong, keep left, which is not wrong, but not good either, and a cam is definitely inappropriate in this sort of location. So width markers provide a standardized message. So it's again, providing the same sign in the same location to provide the same message to drivers so that there's no confusion. And also minimises your legal liability as well. Obstruction markers. So obstruction markers are used to delineate obstructions within or above the road, such as road closures or at low bridges. So they actually go on the bridge, again, in order to just highlight the bridge. The ones on Montague Street, you might have noticed, are actually red and white rather than black and white, which is non-standard, but like they're trying to do everything there to try to highlight the low bridge at Montague Street. And it doesn't have chevrons because you can't go either side of that sign. It's just an obstruction. Oh, there's the Montague Street again. So the Montague Street has adopted red and white stripes instead of black and white stripes in order to try to bring more attention to that situation. Here, that shouldn't be a chevron because you can't actually drive to the left or the right. It should be simply an obstruction marker. Cool. Any questions again, Kathy?
Not at the moment. Thanks for taking them throughout the session. If anyone has any questions, please just type them into the chat or the Q&A.
Okay, good. And we're going well for time, so there's probably time for more questions towards the end. Parking signs. So this is our next little topic, of particular interest to those of you in local government, but also important for people in the state government as well. So these are regulatory signs. They control parking along a road or in parking areas. The parking restriction information should be unambiguous. After all, parking is one of the greatest sources of revenue. Probably more infringement notices are issued regarding parking than any other type of road infringement. And they will get challenged if the signs are not standardised, unambiguous, clear, compliant with everything. Time restrictions should be simple. They're legally enforceable under the road rules, of course, and the guidance is in part 11 of the Australian Standard. So here's some examples. 1P, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. But because there are no days listed there, it means every day. And 1P Saturday means all day Saturday. You actually don't need the words all day on this sign, and you don't need the words every day on this sign, and you don't need at all times on that sign. The idea is to keep them as simple and explicit as possible. There are standard fonts and standard colours. Make sure that you comply with those to make sure that the signs are enforceable and not likely to be challenged in court. Green means parking permitted. Red means there's some sort of restriction or prohibition. And the signs may include, and often do include, lots of additional messages about exemptions and other stuff, which can make them awfully complicated. Clearway signs, I'm sure you're familiar with. A simple parking sign just saying parking is permitted is also viable. This is an example of parking for people with disabled parking permits are only permitted in that location. The S with a strike through means no stopping and has no exemptions, and no parking means pretty much the same thing, but you are allowed to stop for, I've forgotten what it is. Is it 2 minutes, and you're not allowed to move more than a few meters away from the car or something? Probably like me, a lot of the members of the public don't quite understand the difference between no stopping and no parking. But there is a subtle difference. No parking is rarer. It's not as common on our roads, whereas no stopping is fairly common. The green P for parking permitted, zone signs where a particular zone applies and there's some restriction associated with that zone, and clearway is pretty much the same as no stopping, except that the infringement fine is more. The clearway has exemptions for public buses and commercial passenger vehicles, including taxis, that can actually stop within a clearway, whereas they can't stop in no stopping, because no stopping should be reserved for safety locations where you really don't want anyone stopping. The arrows should be in the same colour as as the main message. So if the main message is parking permitted, then a green arrow. If it's a restriction or prohibition, then it should be red arrows. The time periods and times of day, there's examples. We don't put 9.00 for 9 o'clock, we just put 9. Ambulances accepted, motorcycles only. So they're all viable options. So there's some common layouts. There are particular things in the standard about whether you use minutes or hours. So I can't quite remember what they all are, but I think half an hour is a half, but 5 minutes I think is 5 minutes. So you need to be compliant with those. What else is there to say about these examples? They all look sensible, and it's much easier to grab pictures from the Australian standard for parking signs that comply. But if you take pictures of signs in real life, it's hard to remember whether they comply or not. Okay, so this is putting a few options together. 1p meter parking, the times of day are specified, the days of the week are specified, Saturday is specified as well. You notice that the 530, the 30 is actually in a smaller font than the 5, but from a distance that makes it more readable. And if there's an exemption, then you can put an exemption or regarding a particular class of vehicles. However, I mean, although we're saying safe system solutions vehicles accepted in a tongue-in-cheek, that probably is not enforceable because there's no definition in the road rules about what a safe system solutions vehicle is. Does it mean my vehicle because I'm employed by Safe System Solutions occasionally as a contractor, or is it Kathy's vehicle because she's actually a permanent employee? You need to make sure that any of these exemptions or limitations are clearly defined so that they can actually be enforced. And the best way to do that is through a permit system, generally speaking, unless the type of vehicle, like a motorcycle, for instance, is quite well defined what it is. And a police vehicle is pretty clearly a police vehicle, and ambulance, etc. But other types of vehicles, if they're not well defined, then it is open to challenge. Cool. So some of the issues about layout. The height of the signs is important. The general guidance is they should be 2 meters above the footpath and 2.2 meters above the road surface. This is so people don't hit their heads on the signs when they're walking past them. They don't get hit by car doors, and they can be seen over the top of a car. They probably can't necessarily be seen over the top of a truck, but at least over the top of a car. Where the signs cover a side road or a laneway even, then if you're putting up the permissive signs, then it's a good idea to put up the no stopping signs as well. But if there are no permissive signs along the road, you don't need to put up the no stopping sign because the road rules cover that anyway. No stopping within 10 meters, I think it is, of an intersection. There are a few other points to make about that. Oh, the 75 metre spacing. The Australian Standard actually has, in I think one of its appendixes, a requirement that the signs should be spaced no more than 75 metres apart, so that you can actually have a good chance of seeing the sign and reading the sign, particularly if there's a lot of parked vehicles there already. And The other requirement is that the sign face should be angled around about 30 degrees, plus or minus a bit, from the line of curb. And that's so that they're facing towards the oncoming driver, although the driver's got to be travelling fairly slowly to be able to read and understand the sign. So because those things are written into the Australian Standard, again, compliance is important because people are going to take every opportunity they can to challenge parking infringements. Some additional points: public holidays. For signs that show days of operation, then the word public holidays is required for that restriction to also apply on a public holiday. Otherwise, if it says something like Monday to Saturday and Friday happens to be a public holiday, then the restriction will not apply on the public holiday unless you put public holes on the sign itself, which adds to the complexity of the sign. So, you know, don't put it on unless you really have to. Short-term parking should be P 2 minutes. So you are permitted to park here for a maximum time of 2 minutes. Don't put no stopping 2 minutes. No stopping 2 minutes doesn't actually make sense. Does it mean you're not allowed to stop for 2 minutes, but you're allowed to stop for 3 minutes? It actually is not a logical sequence of information. Midday is shown as 12 noon, midnight is shown as midnight, in order to make a very clear distinction between the two. And 12 AM and 12 PM, there's arguments about which is which, so avoid that completely and use 12 noon and midnight. Area parking. So if it's an area park, you require the sign on all the entrances to the parking area and exit signs to say this is the end of a 2P area or whatever it might be. And internal reminder signs, you are within a parking area 2P, blah, blah, blah. I very rarely see, but are actually quite a good idea if you've got a large parking area. Permit parking is generally shown through a zone sign, permit zone, and then the council issues various permits for various different areas. Is a good legal way of enforcing that. Okay, we can have a bit of a question here, Kathy. See if anyone can raise their hand and spot what's the problem with this sign. And it's a very subtle problem. Does anyone like to have a go at this?
All right, everyone's having a good look at it, I think, including myself, and I know what the problem is. So if you want to type it in or raise your hand and oh, we've got no takers.
No takers. Well, it is hard. It is
hard.
hard.
Hold on. We've got one. Oh, they're all coming through now. There we go. So some of the comments: parking until 5:30. The time duration on one side is different.
Oh, well, that's all right. You can have different times on different sides, although I don't really know why you would do that, but Monday to Friday, 4:30 and 5:30. I mean, do you really need to have that difference? Or I'd split the difference and make it 5 o'clock. That'd be clearer.
No standing and parking on the same side. Shish has pointed out sign confusion because we're all there.
Yes, yeah, I think we're all with you on that one. Okay, well, look, the answer is a bit more subtle than that. And the subtlety is about the fonts. Okay. You probably wouldn't have picked this. So if you use the standard fonts, the it's narrower fonts. I think it's Series D rather than Series E or something like that. And you notice how the 12:30 p.m. is almost falling off the side of the sign here and like touching the line there. And the spacing between the 1 and the 2 is really taking up a lot of space on the sign face. So that's a subtlety that our colleague Viseth, who you will meet next week, picks up that very few of the rest of us pick up. But that's the problem, is they've actually used non-standard fonts, and therefore the space available to fit in the words is a bit more difficult. The rest of it I all agree with about confusion and, you know, why 5:30 and 4:30, does there really need to be a difference in times there? All of that are valid comments as well.
So the real question is, can I get off my parking fine?
On
a
basis
font
of,
technicality.
on a font technicality, you might be pushing it. But on this technicality, I reckon you'd probably have a very good chance. So the question here is, how long can I park to the left-hand side of the sign on Saturdays before noon? 10 minutes or half an hour? So clearly that is ambiguous and stupid. Are we allowed to use the word stupid? You know, I think what we're all learning from this is try to keep it as simple as possible if you possibly can. And I know the councils are under a lot of pressure to balance out all the different demands for parking, parking and loading zones and turnover. So it can be complicated, and sometimes the compromises can add to more complication. But really, for the sake of the drivers themselves understanding what's going on, try to keep it as simple as possible if you can. And here's some more examples, again from another state, fortunately, which just add to the complexities. And that's really going overboard. Okay, pavement markings in relation to parking. So if the parking is there all the time, then mark the bays with complete lines. If, however, there's a clear way going through the parking lane at some times of the day, then don't mark all the parking bays with solid lines, just mark them with these markings, which are sometimes called hockey sticks. I don't quite know why. This looks like a hockey stick, but this just looks like a T to me. So that's the suggestion there. Yellow lines, so a yellow unbroken edge line means no stopping under the road rules, and it's a pavement marking, so you can't really have any exemptions or exceptions, or like it's just no stopping, full stop. That's it. So that's quite a valid thing to use, and I would encourage a bit more use of the yellow edge line instead of a no stopping sign. A few years ago, I advocated let's use both, because people in Victoria aren't quite used to yellow lines yet, but they've been around for long enough that now we could probably use yellow lines without reinforcing them with no stopping signs. You can use a broken yellow edge line to supplement signposted zones where only certain types of vehicles are permitted to stop. That is rarely done in Victoria. I think we prefer to actually put, well, the signs are necessary anyway, so it's just a question of, do you reinforce the signs with a broken yellow line? And they do in other states, but not so much in Victoria. Disabled parking bays. This is now the new standard for disabled parking bays, having an area of space adjacent to what is basically a standard sized bay to give sufficient space for a person in a wheelchair to get in and out. And that's the type of sign that should be used. and the symbol should be a white wheelchair accessibility symbol on a blue background. And if you have footpaths nearby, you really need to have a curb ramp so that the person in the wheelchair can get from the road pavement up into the footpath. And all of that's specified in the Australian Standard, and we should comply with that as much as possible. Sometimes space constraints mean that it's difficult, and it's a difficult choice then to say, do we not put it in at all, or do we put it in substandard? And that can be a bit of a tricky decision to make. So, any questions about parking signs?
Not at the minute, David. We've got about 8 minutes to go, so we've got an exercise to run through.
Yep. All right. So this is the exercise that we're asking you to do between now and next Wednesday. So you've got a bit of time, got nothing else to do over the weekend. Have a bit of a go at this. So this is the layout. There's a bus parking here. There's a disabled parking here, and there's more information in the background to tell you what it is. 1 hour parking on the north side between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Monday to Friday. The bus zone, a disabled parking on the south side, a pickup drop-off parking zone with a maximum parking time of 2 minutes between 9:30 a.m. to 12 noon on Saturdays, and continuous no stopping between the pickup drop-off zone and the disabled parking bay, with an exception for council vehicles. Okay, an exception for council vehicles. Hopefully council vehicles are well defined. So the black circles on that diagram represent where the posts would go. So your challenge is just to design the sign face that would go on each of those posts. Now, in doing so, we're not asking you to do a work of art. I've drawn one up here, and I've tried to use the right colours, green P and blue disabled parking symbol, and the word only is also in blue. So the colours are important, so try to do it in colour if you possibly can. And I've drawn this upside down because when you draw the sign face there, you need to make sure that the arrow is pointing in the direction that it should be facing. So you actually need to turn the piece of paper through 180 degrees to actually work out where that should go. But in order to avoid the problem of the arrow pointing in the wrong direction, it's a good idea to draw the sign in the direction that it will be actually facing on the road. So that's just an example. And as I say, we're not expecting you to sort of draft these up in a perfect way, but just indicate what, sketch out what should be shown on each sign face. So that is your challenge for the next week, and all of the information on that is on the site, on Schoolology. So our last little topic is about sign installation. Information about sign sizes is in Appendix B of the Australian Standard Part 2. Basically it says, and this is fairly nebulous advice, I suppose, the A size is used mainly in urban environments and where the speeds are less than 70 kilometres an hour. B size for 70 kilometres an hour and above, and arterial roads. C size where B size is still too small, which is not really providing you much advice, really. And D or E size for freeways and high-speed roads. So there's a bit of leeway there, but that's sort of general guidance on how you choose the different sizes where they're available. Try to avoid signs overlapping each other. You might think that this is creating a bit more stability in the sign as it's attached to the post, but really we don't want to cover up any of the sign face. Just separate them is better. the spacing from any obstructions and how far back from the roadway. If it's a barrier curb, then about 300 millimeters. If it's a fully mountable or semi-mountable curb, then 500 millimeters. If there's no curb but just a shoulder, then these dimensions here would be appropriate to the guidepost and to the edge of a sign. If there's safety barrier, 600 millimeters back behind the face of the safety barrier are the general requirements in the Australian standard. Sign heights. This is a table from the VicRoads supplement to the Australian standard, which provides a little bit more information than the Australian standard does itself. But generally for rural roads, the height, and the height is measured to the underside of the sign, would be 1.5 metres. In urban areas, 2 metres if there's no parking, but if you want the sign to be seen over parked cars, then 2.2 metres. Signs on medians or traffic islands, 1.5 metres. But all keep left signs, I reckon, should be 0.5 to 0.7 metres above the road surface, because we really don't want them at a location where they're going to obstruct the driver's view. So low mounting them is preferable. And I highlight that because I see quite a lot of keep left signs that are actually mounted at 1.5 metres because someone's read this table and hasn't bothered reading further down the table. And similarly with hazard markers, keep left signs and hazard markers should be low mounted as much as possible. So mostly common sense applies with all of this, but there's some general guidance. Overhead mounted signs need to have a clearance of at least 5.3 metres to the road surface. So that's pretty clear. And the sign orientation, this is a bit of a subtlety, but it's recommended that the signs be placed about 5 degrees away from normal to the road, if it's a straight road. And the reason for that is because the retroreflective properties of the sign are good and will still work, you know, if you're 5 or 10 degrees away from being straight on to the driver. But there's also mirror reflection that can occur off the sign face, just because it happens to be a shiny surface. So to avoid the mirror reflection, the recommendation is to just angle them slightly away from perpendicular to the road. Types of signposts. The choice of signpost is important in order to ensure safety, because at some stage someone could well crash into the sign and it's the posts they're likely to hit. So preferably steel tube with a breakaway base. So firstly, if it's just a single steel tube, that is regarded as being frangible. It will generally bend over if hit with any force. But if you've got multiple posts, then if a driver hits 2 posts, that is a bit more rigid, and so they should preferably be breakaway. Fluted aluminium is another choice. Alum lattice is another choice, or larger ones. The breakaway posts are mounted in concrete in the ground, and then the breakaway element is this part down here, which has been designed to shear away if hit with any force. And at the back there are the angled posts in order to make sure that the sign actually stays up if there's a strong wind. So all of that those components have been designed to be good. The slip base itself should be no more than 125 millimeters from the ground surface, because you don't want the bottom of the car snagging on the bottom part of the sign, which is solidly encased in the concrete. Frangible aluminium posts are becoming more popular, which is good. And I'm going to skip through the last few slides pretty quickly, or maybe we can come back to them next week. These are the lattice type aluminium signposts, which are quite expensive, but very good. If you're mounted behind, so if you have a really large sign, basically it's got to be structural and therefore it's not forgiving, so it needs to be mounted behind guardrail. And all of that is important because of these sorts of issues that happen. Okay, I think we're at the end there, Kathy. So
we are, David. Thank you. Thanks very much. And we've just some questions about the exercise. Basically, you can complete it on the hard copy that you received, or the electronic version, and you can use screenshots for your signs and that sort of thing. So that's fine. No need for the sizing. Is that right, David? We don't have to put the size sign on it. No. So it's really just looking for the layout. And any questions, any concerns, please email us throughout the time period. It really is a learning exercise, so don't get too caught up in, you know, if you don't get it 100% correct. The idea is that you work through it and you know, as David said earlier, it's when you start to look at the tables and that sort of thing, that's when you really get to understand it. So thank you very much, David. Thanks everyone for your questions and participation, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.
Yep.
Great.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.